Yes, we can hear you, and I've just started recording, so.
Okay, great. So it's very nice to see all of you, two of you, and to know that others are here too. And I can hear myself, so I will mute all of you. Can I do this? Okay, oh, you just mute. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so today's lecture is the second lecture. Third lecture, if you'll include Malabou's lecture, and we are going to talk about neuropsychoanalysis. So, as I said on the previous lecture, what we did, I was trying to criticize Freud, and I told you that on our next lectures we'll try to rehabilitate him. So today we'll start to do it, and we'll employ the neuropsychoanalysis, its perspective on Freud, on his works, and on the psychoanalysis in general. And as I said on the previous meeting, neuropsychoanalysis is considered just a part of more general phenomena, which is called neuropsychology. So we will talk mostly about neuropsychoanalysis, but we'll talk about neuropsychology too. So just a like introduction. And so neuropsychoanalysis in general, to explain what this phenomena is about, it proclaims itself to be a discipline that presents a synthesis of neurological and psychoanalytical approaches. So it can be understood from its name. And so it's tried to see both the biological brain, the objective brain, the brain that is subject of study of neuroscience, but it adds to it the subjective perspective, subjective mind. As I said, the Freud's perspective was perspective of considering, first of all, subjective mind. And he switched his perspective, although he was a neuroscientist and he was involved in objective science, but he switched his perspective and started to invented psychoanalysis and started to investigate subjective mind from the subjective point of view. So neuropsychoanalysis belong to the new generation of researchers who try to contest this the pure and simple rejection of psychoanalysis, this rejection of psychoanalysis, which actually was a common since the 90s, 50s, since the Salovey book and this time, and other books started from Salovey's revisionist work. So from 1950, the rejection, pure rejection of psychoanalysis was very common among neurologists, and what neuropsychoanalysis tried to do is try to contest this this tendency of rejection of psychoanalysis, and it proclaims that it is necessary in a way to return to Freud, to come back to Freud, but not just to come back to Freud, but we shouldn't, by doing this, we shouldn't, of course, avoid neuroscientific knowledge. So all the neuroscientific knowledge that we have now, it's okay, it's nothing to reject here, but we should have just to add some Freudian perspective, some perspective of subjective, some subjective perspective, the perspective of study not just brain but the mind as subjective phenomena. So in this view, neuropsychoanalysis see Freud not just as a betrayer of neurology as it was common. So Freud betrayed the objective science and invented psychoanalysis, so he's a betrayer. No, he's not. On the contrary, he can be seen, his switch can be seen as a promotion of neuroscientific investigations. So he's not a betrayer, he's a promoter. And that's the perspective neuropsychoanalysis tries to consider Freud. And so as I said, neuropsychoanalysis is a more recent phenomena, and what was before neuropsychoanalysis it was just neuropsychology. And one of the, I'll show you the picture, one of the neuropsychologists was Oliver Sacks. You probably know, he's well known. I have a picture of him, it's here. He just died recently. And Oliver Sacks, he wrote numerous best-selling books. Most of them are a collection of case studies of his patients or other patients, those people who have neurological disorders. And his book, most of his books are just detailed description of his experience with his patients, and how they deal with their conditions. And in one of his books, which is called A Leg to Stand On, Sacks also described his own accident, a near fatal accident, which he had when he was 41. And the accident is that he fell down off a cliff and he severely injured his left leg. And when he was 41, so he was already for a long time, he was already a physician, had his own patients. And as a result of this injury, and what he tries to explain is this book, he discovers what does it feel to be a patient, what does it feel to become a patient himself. And in hospital, when he was a patient, he felt, as he said, as he writes, he felt exactly the same like he was told by most of patients, that is, he felt useless and ignored. So that's how patients feel, the neurological patients feel. And from this new perspective of patient, from the perspective of this new experience, he examined in this book, A Leg to Stand On, he re-examined the therapeutical process itself and its relationship between patient and physician. Simultaneously, he also presents his view on what is neuropsychology and what it has to be. So this is his way of, from this perspective, he started to rethink this relationship between between patient and physician, and from this perspective he rethought what neurology should be, and he claims it should be neuropsychology. And by neuropsychology, he means that, he claims that neurology and medicine of his time reflects on themselves as merely mechanical iterations of tasks and tasks. So it's something mechanical, and they because of this, within this perspective, they tend to present a patient as purely passive. And neurologists of his time had the reputation, as he states, of brainy and heartless. They have no heart, but they're clever, they know what to do. So it was, and why is that? Oliver Sacks claimed that, and it's very important, I think, that why they have this reputation of brainless, of brainy and heartless, because for them they're just physicians, and they have to keep distance from the patients because it's every patient is a tragedy, and it's you have to protect yourself, and you have to keep from entering this strange and like Oliver Sacks claims, this strange and often terrifying world. So in pure medicine, the question of existence, of this deep and terrible existence, is usually excluded. And that was precisely what Oliver Sacks was against this perspective. And his works, his descriptions of these cases, of his patient cases, and the way they deal with their problems, with their disease, is this precisely the opposite. So this he entered there. He started to be close to them. He saw them not as a passive object that had to be cured, but yeah, as people with terrifying problems with their own drama. And so he changed this perspective. And classical neurology, as Sachs claims, had no room for such matters because of this physician's desire of safety and detachment from this world of disease, this terrifying world of disease. Because of this detachment, it was impossible for them to investigate the very phenomena of sickness and health. Because to investigate it, you have to get involved with the patient. You have to talk to them to understand them. So that was something that he discovered, and that was neurology of his time didn't have. So as he claims, and he explains, tried to explain what was this classical neurology about, he claimed that Jackson and Sherrington, those were two traditional neurologists, and they were those who found the commonly accepted vision of the nervous system. And this commonly accepted vision of his time was, even of our time, is a perception of the nervous system as a machine. And Sachs claimed that this mechanical view, in Jackson's view, is within this perspective, there is nothing spontaneous and nothing alive. And Sherrington was, in his practice, he was working with cats, dogs, and other animals whose cerebral hemispheres were removed. So what he saw and was really purely mechanical reflex reactions, and those reactions were deprived of any self and any will, so any living eye. And, in analogy with this, he understood human nervous system. He even called those preparation Cartesian trigger puppets. So for this reason, Sachs calls those traditional neurology epipathology. So because it perceives patients as passive, purely mechanical beings, as reflex puppets. So within such perspective, patients were studied as passive and defective machines. And concerning the new science that has to be invented, Oliver Sacks claims that, I quote, so how he understands new neurology, neuropsychology. I quote, the new neurology is radically different. It moves out from the Sherringtonian laboratory with its rows of decerebrate preparation and into the factory, the playground, the world where people actually do things. And it studies what they do and how they do them. Patients of old neurology did not act. Their actions were excluded. All they did was submit to passive tests. But the crucial test for neuropsychology is a test of action. A man is asked to do something, to walk, to jump, skip, or run, and his procedure is minutely noted. This is the absolutely radical change. End of quote. To this change of perspective, this involvement into the world of patient instead of considering them as detached from the physician, from the therapist, he called the radical switch of perspective. So, developing his concept of neuropsychology, he finds his inspiration in Luria. Luria was a Russian neurologist, also the inventor of neuropsychology. And Luria aimed to alter this veterinary approach to peripheral disorders. And in Luria's work, Sachs saw the ideal of human medicine, that is, the medicine that is contrary to the one that treats patients as a thing, as passive thing or machine. So what they were intended to, what Oliver Sacks was intended to invent was the human, as he called humanized science. And Sacks claimed that Luria practiced a warm science, a romantic science, so the science that he himself liked, but secret and loving science. And but he did it under cover of empirical old neurology. So in his works, he still was writing in the style of this old empirical neurology. And for this reason, Oliver Sacks claimed that Luria's neuropsychology is not enough, because there was two Lurias. There was one Luria for Oliver Sacks. There was one Luria in his letters to him and in his communication with patients, which was warm and which was human. And there was another Luria in his works, which were just normal classical neurobiological works. So after he died, there remained only one Luria, the Luria who just representative of old neurology. And so Sacks claimed that when Luria died, he revealed the impersonality of his science, so that Luria's science was still cold and repellent pathology. Apart from Luria, other sources of Oliver Sacks' inspiration are other Russian neurologists, that is Leontiev and Zaporozhets. Their new science was aimed to be a science of doing, so they saw that actions are very important, and actions, processes, all that has to do not just with stability, not with fixed conditions, but with actions and processes. So it was their science was aimed to be science of doing, and its certain concepts were those of actions, of performance, and in this it was opposite to classical neurology, because classical neurology was essentially static, and classical neurology saw, because it was static, it saw the problems in reduced functions. And Leontiev and Zaporozhet's neuropsychology was one that was able to recognize those affected programs and system, and correspondingly the way they tried to do a therapy to rehabilitate patient was by developing the compensatory systems. So not just fixing, not just you don't just fix patients with the therapy. You develop some compensatory systems, which is the process. You switch the new process on, and you see the problem as a process, and you switch the therapy is supposed to be a process too. So, but still, Sacks claims that Leontiev and Zaporozhets were not able to see precisely the living self and the living eye of their patients. And so the same story here as with Luria. Oliver Sacks was not fully satisfied even with Leontiev and Zaporozhets neuropsychology. So although, as Oliver Sacks claims, although their neuropsychology deals with performances and procedures, it's still in its heart is still a pathology, because it can't see the living self. So they still insist on analyzing this activity in mechanical terms. And according to Sohm, they speak of programs, procedures, solving motor tasks as if their patients were computers or keyboards. And I quote, he claims, they miss the essential beauty and mystery of action. They miss its grace, its musicality. They miss the very sense of movement. And it was just this, which has to be regained. End of quote. So for Solms, those Leontiev and Zaporozhet's neuropsychology was still the science of robotics, of pathology, and it has no conception of explaining, of considering, taking into account the sense of being a living free agent. It just was considering humans as robots who were struggling with motor tasks. So he wanted to escape, Oliver Sacks wanted to escape this science of robotics as this purely objective perspective of robotic science, and establish new science, new neuropsychology, which would consider the living self, which would consider something that old neurobiology was deprived of. So he claims, I quote, if a Sherringtonian neurology was the study of trigger puppets, and Lurian neurology, the study of self-activated robots, I had to go beyond this to a neurology of the soul. End of quote. And one more passage from Sacks to explain more his idea on what he wanted to invent. So he claims, I quote, neuropsychology, like classical neurology, aims to be entirely objective, and its great power, its advances come from just this. But a living creature, and especially a human being, is first and last active, a subject, not an object. It is precisely the subject of the living I which is being excluded. What we need now and need for the future is neurology of self, of identity. So Sacks found philosophical foundation of his ideas in Kant, and we'll talk about Kant later when we'll start to when we'll take a look on more precisely on neuropsychoanalysis. Also, since Sacks, because Sacks was always talking about this central finding, centrating his patient, finding living center of their patients. He was capable of developing his philosophical. He was capable of developing his philosophical conceptualization of his methodology of this finding living center after he read Kant, because in Kant he found those idea of living center, that subject is more important than objective perception of the world, that there's no such thing as subjective perspective of the world. So since Sacks was talking about this living personal center, about finding a living center among the neurological, as he calls neurological devastation, Kant was an appropriate theoretical ground for him. And in his philosophy, because in Kant's philosophy, the concept of the self is restored. That's what Kant did in his Copernican term. He restored the living center, and this was the philosophical basis for Oliver Sacks' methodology. And just to criticize Oliver Sacks now, before we'll start to consider neuropsychoanalysis, I don't really agree with Oliver Sacks here, because I like more the idea that everything is fine with neurobiology, and it moves in a proper direction. We found out about lots of things, how brain, considering from the objective perspective, works, and it's fascinating. Yeah, and it would be nice to add some subjective perspective, Freudian perspective, but I think that his books are best selling because of this call to romanticize, to make it more romantic, to make science more romantic. And it sounds like, although he claims in some of the quotes, he claims that yes, we have to, the neurobiology is a really great thing, and we just have to, and like I said, its greatness in lies in those objective studies, and we have to just add there the the perspective of subjective, of living, so just to improve the objective side. But sometimes he sounds as he sounds like he criticizes neurobiology, neurology, like there is something wrong with it, and like we can substitute it with with some signs of feeling, and just feeling and be close to patient and feeling love to patient, and just enough. Sometimes he sounds like this, and his books are amazing because of those case studies, because of you see the tragedy of the patient, but it sometimes gives you impression that he's against the objective science, and he thinks that there's something else is more important. So I showing you this picture because when I'm not agree with him, I like to think that he's holding his own brain. So what I like more is neuropsychoanalysis, because neuropsychoanalysis is just the right thing. It's considered neuroscience as really important, and it's in really amazing, wonderful ways. It just adds the subjective perspective to neuropsychoanalysis. Although it's wonderful because it's like Freud, but it's in a normal way, not just like idle like we do in philosophy. It's without criticizing him. It sees him, as we said on a previous lecture, as a neurobiologist, and his greatness lies in this neurobiology, and it can be useful for, according to neuropsychoanalysis, it can be useful for neurobiology, and it can improve neurobiology, his perspective. So we'll talk about neuropsychoanalysis now. As I said, it was inspired by Luria, by Oliver Sacks. So it's one of the key representatives of neuropsychoanalysis is Mark Solms, and I hope you read his wonderful papers, at least one of them. In his work, in his books, he draws attention to the fact, like we discussed already, that Freud was, even in his later psychoanalytic work, Freud still was a neuroscientist, and he because he had a specific scientific program in his mind, which he started to develop in his earlier neuroscientific work. So he was a neuroscientist, like we discussed, and even when he started to be when he invented psychoanalysis, he still his project of psychoanalysis can be still considered as the prolongation of the project, of the scientific project, which he started when he was a neuroscientist. So he shifted to philosophical method from the objective science, because as I said, because this brain science of his time did not have the tools necessary for exploring those aspects of human mind which Freud was interested in. And as Solms proved with a wonderful passage from Freud, I quote Freud, "We must recollect that our provisional ideas of psychology will presumably have day to be based on an organic substructure. We are taking this probability into account in replacing the special chemical substances by special physical forces." End of quote. So Freud believed that one day there's going to be a day, and he was waiting for it, that science would be able to talk in its scientific language, in proper scientific language of objective science, about those things that he was talking about, his ideas, which were based on his subjective methods. So the problem with science at his time was not that it was in the wrong direction. It was not developed enough to be able to talk in its objective terms about what Freud was interested in. But Freud hoped that one day it will be, and the one day all his ideas was just drafts that has to be proved, or on the contrary, or has to be criticized by objective science. And furthermore, Freud always claimed that one day neuroscience will develop to such extent that it will solve all the questions that he encountered using his subjective methodology. So he was just maybe we should perceive his theory as questions for neurobiology to solve. But it was not. It was never that he criticized objective science. Maybe criticized as not developed enough, but and not as a phenomenon. It's not that something wrong with it, and that so he chose to be a scientist, an objective scientist. Well, but today, yeah, so what were the methodological limitations that Freud encountered in his time? As I said, neurobiology was, although it was already at the time of Freud, Raymond Cahill invented the neurological neuron doctrine, that it was known about the neuron and that brain consists of separate neuron, but it was not clear how the neuron system functions. And but today, everything that Freud wanted to, not everything, but many things that Freud really wanted to explore, it is within perspective that he employed, with the perspective of subjective science, and he hoped that one day it would be possible to explain and to prove or disprove from the position of objective science. It is quite possible today, because Solms claims that neuroscience, not just Solms, it's well-known fact that neuroscience today experienced a huge technical and methodological advances. So that, among others, here we can we can talk about electroencephalography, which was invented in 1930, and it was just practiced, started to practice after the war. And this represents the introduction of a capability to observe and measure and dynamic aspects of brain activity. So what Freud was intended to do. And I'll show you some pictures of electroencephalography. I have them here. Just a second. There's the picture of electroencephalogram. Here. So it's really beautiful thing that you can one can see using this stuff. So another important breakthrough was the development of magnetoencephalography, MAG. MAG allows to study neural dynamic associated with mental events, even on the level of milliseconds, so much more precisely. And another important mechanical advances is introduction of computerized tomography in 1970s. And this computerized tomography allows to identify the precise location of brain lesion when the patient is still alive. And introduction to computerized tomography was followed by magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. And maybe I have some pictures here. MRI. Here's the picture of MRI. So, and also the functional neuroimaging, the functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, which started to be used from 1990s, and then emission tomography, PET, and also so just to summarize this this topic about how neuroscience has advanced its methodology. So those recent inventions, they allow to directly observe neurodynamic processes under changing physiological conditions. And that is to say, the neuroscience of our time has improved its method to such extent that it can study the dynamic nature of the mind. So it is capable of identifying even the unconscious substructure. So this means that neuroscience has radically changed since time of Freud, and it's also means that the Freud's dream has come true. It is possible now to tell in objective terms and within the objective methodology of neuroscience to describe those processes that Freud tend to describe within the language of psychoanalysis. And this is the precise level of neuroscience now that it starts to be capable to answer those questions that Freud, within this perspective of psychoanalysis, asked. And so what was absolutely impossible in Freud's time and what forced him to abandon objective science now become possible. And yeah, and we don't have any more the problem with his wife, so nobody needs to anger her. And now it's possible to do everything that Freud dreamed about. And just to quickly claim that for Solms, but Solms has some highly rational reasons to claim that Freud, if he would live in our days, he would welcome all those. He would welcome this, all those developments of neuroscience, because he would saw it as the development of the work that he pioneered, and the prolongation of his own inspirations, and he would also like the idea of neuropsychoanalysis, because this conjunction of subjective approach and objective approach, which is neuropsychoanalysis, which is the intercrossing of neuroscience and psychoanalysis. And so to explain in more detail what is neuropsychoanalysis and how Solms see what is neuropsychoanalysis. So on a philosophical level, neuropsychoanalysis justifies itself as an issue of relation between mind and brain, which is also is known under the name of mind-body problem. So the important question here is the question of how mind relates, what is the relation between mind and brain. It is also important philosophical question, and the way neuroscientists might answer this question in that by explaining the brain, he explains also the mind. So there is nothing else. We shouldn't talk about mind at all. We should talk about only the brain, and that's enough. Explaining the brain, we're explaining the mind. So we need only the subjective perspective. But neuropsychoanalysis stands on the conceptual position of, probably know, the dual aspect monism. And this position was also shared by Freud. And to explain it, we have to return to Kant again, because Kant was the one who made this Copernican turn in philosophy. And as I said, Kant started to see everything that exists in the world, including ourselves, our own God, our own mind. He stated that we can't know it, that we can know it only indirectly, so never directly. Everything is accessible for us only through the indirect representation. And so this is the Copernican revolution in philosophy, this switch of perspective. And I quote Kant from The Critic of Pure Reasons to explain this switch of perspective. So hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects, but all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori by means of concept have on this assumption ended in failure. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more succeed in the task of metaphysics. If we suppose that object must conform to our knowledge, we should then be proceeding precisely on the lines of Copernicus' primary hypothesis, failing of satisfactory progress in explaining the movements of the heavenly bodies and the supposed that they all revolved around the spectator. He tried whether he might not have better success if he made the spectator to revolve and the stars to remain in rest. End of quote. So, and Freud actually, he also, when he uses term the mind in itself, Freud here refers directly to Kant and base his ideas on Kant perspective, on Kant switch of perspective. And in his papers, Freud usually describe his position in Kantian terms. So for Freud, what is the mind in itself is the mind in itself is unconscious, and unconscious is the nature of the mind. Unconscious is directly unknowable. We can't know it directly. Same like in Kant's perspective, we can't know. We are not able to know the world directly, only indirectly. The same is with unconscious. We don't know it directly. It is directly unknowable. So it can be described only in abstract models. We can develop abstract models, and in this way, in indirect way of developing these models, we can describe the mind. And this is what psychoanalysis do. It develops those abstract models that describe the unconscious, something that we are not able to know directly. So the term, this term, the mind in itself, points to the fact that we can't perceive the mind in itself directly. So just by looking inwards, the mind in itself becomes known only indirectly and always incompletely through the representation. So once again, we never know the mind itself directly. What we can do is to construct abstractions and some abstract models. That is to elaborate metapsychology, because these abstract models is metapsychology, and that was what Freud did. It was a Freud idea of unconscious. Explaining unconscious, what he did, he developed those abstract model of our mind, of something that we can't know, or we don't know directly. So agreeing with Kant, he supposed that world is known only indirectly for us, but as Dawkins and some other scientists argue that there is an evolutionary pressure that organism that has better developed representation of reality, they have evolutionary advantages. So, for example, those who have night vision, or those who have eyes They have more evolutionary. They are more advanced over those who have no eyes or who have no night vision. But so the evolutionary pressure works in such a way that it forces development of better perceptual of better models of reality, of those models of reality that are more precisely correlate with objective reality. That's how we know this objective reality. And that how we can be sure that our model of reality in our mind corresponds to the reality, to the objective reality, because of this mechanism, because we have to perceive it to survive, we have to adequately perceive the reality. But still, even if human mental apparatus delivers highly accurate models of reality, still it is, no matter how advanced these perceptual systems, they're still only representations of reality. It's never can be reality itself. And because of some problems of neuronal patients, we see that this apparatus can be broken, and that reality can be perceived in a different way, in not adequate way. So reality in itself is always somewhere there. As in Kant's philosophy, the thing in itself is unknowable to us. No matter how evolutionary advanced our perception is. So we only can build the abstract models of this reality, and we are not capable of perceiving it indirectly. So what Solms claims, and neuropsychoanalysis, and I agree with him, is that the psychoanalysis has to be perceived as a natural science. In this way, it would be understood and studied properly. And Freud would surely agree with that, as he himself, and as I said, he perceived psychoanalysis as a science, as important, and his investigations as important scientific investigations. So to perceive psychoanalysis in such a way means to see its basis as shared with other natural sciences and that study physical reality, such as biology, physics, and chemistry, and to share as such that shares the principle and understanding of the world. So the subject of study of psychoanalysis is the mind, and it should be understood as a part of physical reality, which in principle is not distinct from the rest of reality. So, and it's governed by the same laws, and it has to be explored in accordance with the same principles as other parts of reality. And Solms criticizes those psychoanalysts who didn't take into account the biological brain, and those who think that there's something wrong with neuroscience, that neuroscience is wrong in the way it perceives and studies the human mind, that to study the brain is inappropriate to understand the human mind. So Solms don't agree with that. He don't agree with those psychoanalysts who think that, who are against neuroscience, and he thinks that it's absurd idea that it is possible only to study a brain, only to study subjective mind, like psychoanalysis do, without considering the brain, because it is only possible to study it. To study it appropriately means to study the correlation between mind and brain. So the correlation between this objective brain and subject from studied from within subjective perspective, that is to study mind. It should be always correlation. One is not enough. So there is no such thing as a brain problem or mind problem. There is no such thing as, for example, brain damage and its we can't say that it's exclusively problem of neurology, because it's something wrong physically with the brain. It's always these problems always correlate with the mind, with the subjective mind as well. So yeah, there are no such thing as mind problems, and there are no such thing as brain problems, because the same thing is not only with physical traumas of the brain. It's the same, like physical traumas of the brain are at the same time simultaneously the problems of objective physical brain and the problem of subjective of the mind, the way a person thinks. And the same story with the mind problem. We can't say that some problem is exclusively problem of the mind. That is problem that not the neurologists have to deal with, but psychoanalysis, because it's not the physical problem, it's problem of the mind. For example, traumas. We think of trauma that psychoanalysis try to cure traumas, and it's not a problem of neurobiology. But still, every trauma has its physical correlation. It's correlation in the physical brain, and even not only traumas. Like every event change your brain completely. It will never be like I'm talking now and you're listening to me, so your brain changes. It will never be same again. You have precisely concrete changes in your mind. That's always a problem of physical. Same with traumas. Yeah, and one of the examples that it was discovered within those, and it's amazing, within those studies of neuropsychoanalysis, it was discovered that people who have histories of childhood sexual abuse, they suffer from measurable, clinically significant hippocampal atrophy. So there's precise, though we usually perceive childhood sexual abuse problems, traumas, as exclusively problems of the mind. We don't usually perceive them as that they have correlation in objective brain, but they do, because every memory, every perception changes the mind and has its imprints in the objective mind. It's not only your thoughts, ideas, or feelings. Everything has its correlation in the physical brain, including those problems of the psychoanalysis that psychoanalysis deals with. So there is no such thing as exclusively brain problem, and any change in brain causes a change in the mind, and vice versa. The change mind means the change. To change the mind means to change the brain, because those, for example, the psychoanalytic therapy, those hours that patients spend with psychoanalysis, it's also has its impact on the physical, on a physical brain. So physical brain also, those therapeutic hours can heal a physical brain as well. For example, it was proved that successful psychotherapy can normalize the hyperactivity of anterior cingulate gyrus and in depressed patients. So when a psychoanalyst talks to a depressed person, it heals the brain too. And it's not only, of course, psychoanalysis, because when you talk to a friend, it works in the same way. You feel better, and it's not because he sent you love, something like this, and it can be measured by in objective science. It can be measured, even if he sent you love, but it's not only this. It also has its correlation always on the physical level, on the level of physical brain. So what neuropsychoanalysis claims is that perspective of psychoanalysis is not enough, but it's very important to the subjective perspective. It's very important thing if you talk about the improvement, the possible improvement in neuropsychology, and of course, a possible improvement in psychoanalysis, because it's very useful knowledge for psychoanalysis that this correlation, necessary correlation, exists. So just to conclude, like Solm states, our mental apparatus can be perceived in two ways. We perceive it with our eyes. When we perceive it with our eyes, we see brain. Solms described it in his book as, I quote, wet, gelatinous, lobular, and embedded within other tissues of the body, end of quote. So it's wet, gelatinous thing that we discover. But on another level, we perceive it introspectively. That is through the examination of our mental and emotional processes. So through examination of our mental and emotional processes, through the reflection of those on those emotional processes, we would be able to observe such mental states as, for example, the pleasure or hunger. So neuropsychoanalysis is aimed to combine those two levels of observation and to correlate them. And because why not? Why just to restrict yourself to one of the perspective, like neuroscience do, just study of not recent neuroscience, including Damasio and all these guys, because they consider the subjective perspective, but just classical neuroscience study only objective brain, and same with psychoanalysis, is study only subjective brain, like neuroscientific findings don't exist, like Freud's basis does not exist. So why to limit yourself just to study of one of the perspective if the correlation of those perspective of subjective and objective is the most promising one? So why just to limit this to the study of the brain or to the study of the mind? Why to exclude one of these perspective? And so the same as Oliver Sacks claimed that neurology was blind to the fact that our brain is capable of experiencing itself. Since we have emotions, we will, and we can express our agency. So we have this living center. And the new neuroscience that he was dreaming about, it's supposed to be complemented with this subjective approach, which neuropsychoanalysis is trying to implement, to add to neurophilosophy. Okay, so that's it. Let's come back to the picture of Freud. Do you have any questions, or you want to discuss anything? Chris, do you want
actually, Rosie had the first question. I don't know.
Okay. So Rosie, do you have a question? No. Okay, Chris, let's come back to you and then we'll see.
All right. It seems to me that Freud was kind of criticized the way that Descartes was when he transferred over to philosophy, because, as we all remember, that Descartes was a mathematician and he came up with a lot of great things in math. But when he came up with the idea of the mind and body, or the trademark argument, he was kind of criticized the same way. But I'm wondering, why is it that Freud was treated the same way when he has the background in neuroscience, when he tried to go to the subjective side, the way that Descartes was back in back when he was? Do you think that there's a kind of correlation between the way that Descartes was treated to compare that Freud was treated?
Yeah, that's interesting question. I mean, that's interesting perspective here to investigate it, but I wasn't trying to investigate it from this perspective, although I consider it very interesting. Yes, but I still think that it's more easier to understand Freud and all of these movements as it's like more intuitive to understand it through Kant. But it's even more interesting to understand it through Descartes, because Descartes is very interesting person himself. But same with Kant, because this Copernicus revolution. It's very difficult for me to understand. But isn't there the mistake in this Copernicus turn? Is it this upside down idea that it's that the subjective perspective is supposed to be the first, the main perspective, but the Copernicus turn, the real one, was precisely the opposite one. So yeah, maybe it's more interesting to explain through the considering the cards here. You are right.
I think the reason I brought it up is because Kant was as critiqued. Maybe when we get to, maybe if you talk about Hegel, it'd be the case. But when it comes to Freud, or if you were to compare him to Freud, he's not as critiqued as Freud was. Yes, he was critiqued, but nowhere compared to Freud. That's why I brought up Descartes, because he was, in a sense, had a criticism towards him rather than Kant. In that sense, I do see the correlation between Freud and Kant. It was just with the criticism, Descartes got it more than Kant did. That's why I brought that up.
Thank you.
So I think Rosie had a question, but her mic is not working.
Okay, I see.
So, Rosie, do you want me to read this, what you've written here? Okay, so has technological developments facilitated the bringing together of many disciplines? And are neuro and psych two of those? As in, is it more than just medical technology that's making it possible for these two to unite with technology at large? Does that sound about right, Rosie? No.
Yeah, I think that technological development is it's not bringing together lots of disciplines, not only neuropsychoanalysis and neuroscience, but because why we are talking here about those two disciplines, it's precisely because neuropsychoanalysis is the intercrossing of those disciplines, and our aim was still philosophical here, just to see psychoanalysis as a part of neuroscience, and not as some self-sufficient field discipline. And but it's not only about those disciplines, and should be understood that there is the border besides such discipline that studies one subject is always very very thin. It can be changed, and in this changing of this border, in this deconstruction of this border, is the development of those disciplines. So of course it's not about only neuroscience and psychoanalysis, and every improvement of disciplines is that one discipline can borrow something from another discipline, or they see these points where they coincide, they see these points where they can be useful to each other, or where they coincide in such a way that they just won, and they prove the series from each field. So yeah. Is it more than just medical tech that is making today's scholars see that every science and discipline can be helpfully, usefully informed by other disciplines? Yeah, I think it's not not only with the development of technological development, with it's not only the course is not only development of technologies, but still the change of perspective, to add the change of perspective, although it is very important, but the change of perspective is important as well. For example, this Damasio theory that we're going to study next lectures, it's just basing on those technologies that exist already. He just switched the perspective. He included the subjective perspective, and he started to that was a breakthrough. He started to study the brain in a totally different way. So you just add the philosophical layer, because learning technology is never enough. It always has to be, always have to know what to study. Something that you have to know what you study, and to have hypotheses which you want to test, and to formulate hypotheses. You need philosophy. You need some crazy ideas. That's a question for you, Rosie, from Sadie. Do you have other questions? Okay, Nina. Is the mind-brain correlation something that is validated through experimentation that is revealing that this connection happens to continuously be there, or is it a philosophically reasoned position? Well, I think that it's a philosophical position, but it changes through the change of perspective. It depends the way you understand this program. It also um, influence the way you investigate all those, the brain and the mind. So it causes the changes in methodology of experimentation within the psychoanalysis and within neuroscience. Both change of perspective is important for both fields, like for every field. It's never experimentation itself. You have to know, you have to have the hypothesis, and to formulate it, you have to be philosophical a little bit. Okay, Samantha, I didn't see. Okay. That's Samantha's question, how much do practitioners and clinicians need to harmonize the application of the abstract model and the mind-brain integrations and interrogation with the new psychoanalysis leading towards synthesizing disorders, and new categories and taxonomies coming into the discourse, which further unites the objective and subjective. And well, I hope so. Yeah, probably. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I'm trying to, but still. And yeah, it's a bit controversial to talk about science from the being a philosopher, but that's at least I try to get to get involved in the scientific discourse, and not just to limit to think that philosophy is always enough. Philosophy can be supplemented by science, and the same with science. I think that for science, philosophy is including psychoanalysis as perceived as a philosophy. It can be useful. Thank you so much. So as Kristen said, you can see now in your syllabus that the requirements for term paper are 2,500 words or no more than 300 words, and the deadline is I indicated it is May 4th, but because it's 1 week after the lecture that I know when will happen. So it's going to be guest lecture. So if you don't mind, we'll keep it like this. Or if you need more time, just supposed to think about it. I think it's the usual requirement is that we have to quote like at least 2 sources, the more the better, from the list of sources, and it just subject can be anything you're interested in, but it has to be related to the general subject of the course. So something to do with philosophy and psychoanalysis, or philosophy and neuroscience, or neuroscience and philosophy, whatever you find interesting.
Hi, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm curious. I'm totally ignorant in that. How does neuropsychoanalytic session look like? My first question. And the second question is this change of perspective that you've been talking about in different contexts. And earlier in the previous lecture, you were talking about like switching languages when you go from one discipline to another discipline. It reminded me something from Wittgenstein, change of aspect. I don't know if it has something to do with that. Maybe it's totally completely different, but it feels like there could be something, interesting there. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, neuropsychoanalysis, it's not a discipline that is complete. It just some of the preliminary. It's trying to find some of the ways how each of discipline can be useful for each other. So it does not has yet. It just appeared a couple of years ago, like 20 years ago, and it. I don't feel comfortable with the Freud looking at me in this way, so maybe I just like to see you more how to get rid of it. Okay, like this. So they don't have some precise therapeutical methodologies, but I know that they try to find some ways that they can combine those neurological therapies with psychoanalytic therapies. Like they can, for example, they can measure what's happening in your brain during the psychoanalytic therapeutical session and to see what happens in the brain, and in this way develop some kind of therapy. So yeah, they state that the point of all these findings is to develop better methodology, better therapies, but still they consider those two disciplines, psychoanalysis and neuroscience, as different ones, but they consider that they can be useful for each other in a different way. And it's interesting about Wittgenstein. He's always useful to think about, to think as the language. That language is precisely very important for science as well. Change the language is to change the perspective sometimes. Okay, Rosie again. Yes.
I got my microphone to work. Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about the background noise. I had sort of a larger question also to go with my first one about sort of cross-disciplinary, like sort of this marriage between neurology and psychiatry that's happening because of medical technologies and various like realizations by scholars, and Freud's own writing on like history, which that's kind of the gist I'm getting from this lecture. But I guess something I've noticed in like sort of pop psychoanalysis or like pop psychiatry is like the trend of like social media posts on like sort of establishing neurodivergence as like equivalent or like on the same level as like disability, like physical disabilities, saying like we have to approach depression as a medical problem that is on par with like fixing a broken arm, or like that's not my argument, and like I know I'm butchering it, but like it's sort of, that's what I'm seeing in like young people producing media that's like depression or like neurodivergence or like ADHD, whatever, is like is a biological phenomenon. And like that's sort of, I'm wondering if that's like indicative of sort of a trickle down effect of academics saying like there is no difference between mind and body, or like kind of if that's like related at all. And I'm sort of wondering what your perspective on like pop sort of the mass impression of what mental illness is, or kind of my question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, what I think that the problem is the way we did, it's my personal opinion. The problem is how the way this pop psychology and popular opinion, the way they distinguish mind and brain, that there is, and maybe this is even the problem of neuropsychoanalysis. But actually, yeah, it simplifies this relation. There is physical brain, and there is like your something that Oliver Sacks call your soul, and you humiliate in your soul, like if you don't consider it and you just treat for example depression with some tablets. But we have to understand that if you take pills, it's you who do this. It was your decision to take a pill. So it's always more complicated than this than the division into medical problem as such as physical problem and problem of the mind. It's much more complicated. There are many layers in this, and those layers to complicate it, to make it more, to see it in a more sufficient light. It's to see it as more complicated, and to see all those layers. Maybe this is the future. To see it, it's more complicated. Those not such precise division between physical problem and problem of the mind. But the problem is here is neuroscience as well, that it thinks that doesn't consider, well, except that for some reason, neuroscientists, like for example Damasio, doesn't consider the subjective mind and only try to do something with the brain to cure the brain without understanding that there's some person over there that has their own thoughts and feelings and feel all of this. And it can be cured with a subjective perspective too, so not only with fixing the brain. Nina has a question.
Yeah, I had a question earlier on. It's a more general question, especially given the nature of this course. I'm wondering, because we're talking about psychoanalysis and neuroscience, and you've touched on this in different ways, but as far as philosophers, if you think that we're at a point, I had written it up a little bit, but I can like paraphrase. If you think that we're at a point where we need to, even as philosophers or activists, given the nature of the questions that we're now coming up, these, like you keep saying, like complex questions that we need to like complexify maybe our approach, and maybe this is sort of the sacrilegious like scientific approach almost, or method of being able to, I had said like to interpret other kinds of like the data that's in front of us, be able to like, do we as philosophers need to, if we really want to contribute, to the questions, do we need to like become scientists to some extent, to be able to interpret the information in a way that's meaningful for our disciplines, to become actually interdisciplinary. I'm wondering what you think about this, or if this is the very kind of perspective thing you might be talking about.
Yeah, I think you're completely right, and that would. But actually, I think that it's very useful for philosophers, because philosophers, they tend to just to think that what they do is something completely separate from the science. That science exists in some separated world. And on this example of Freud, we see that what we perceive as a philosopher and what usually is obvious for us, that like Lacan understands his idea that it's, although he was a scientist himself, the problem with him is we forgot that it has same roots. It deals with same problems, and not just deals with the same problems, but in many aspects, science is much more developed than philosophy. And if philosopher would understand some things that science talks about, it would totally like change her perspective. And but it's not yet. I think so. I think that philosophers have to improve themselves, to become more stronger, to become more advanced. They have to. It's very. It's same. It change your perspective. Same like you read Hegel or like in the same way, because but they did a long time ago, and those investigations, the scientific research, are like more advanced, more up to date. So we do, and many contemporary philosophers, we are not in the Middle Ages anymore. That you just don't care what science. There's no such thing as science. You can just invent some gods, angels, and no physics involved. You have to consider it. That's the great thing, that you can know. You can like understand what happens in your brain. And you just how can you not? How can you live in this age, in this period when it's known, and just consider that you're a philosopher and you just don't care about science? But the problem with neuroscientists, it's still it's worse, because I think that neuroscientists, they need philosophy even more than philosophers need science, because I think that philosophers really need science. But for example, with Damasio, who I who me and Malabou, Malabou supposes that he is a genius, neuroscientist, but a genius. And I agree with her because he's the one who changed this solidly objective perspective of neuroscience. And he started to develop some amazing ideas and involve philosophy, like he involved philosophy in his thinking. But still, when you read those words, his works, and not only his, but any good scientist, you see that it was not a philosopher who was thinking about it, because they don't understand that some things that seem self-obvious for them, like that every person has to be happy, something like that, or every person has to be cured, that you have to be normal. They don't like, but Foucault already wrote that there's no such thing that disease. That disease is it's a artificial construction, and it's changes through the time. It's historical changeable construction. But for them, for scientists, they just, when they talk about science, yes, they know those methods. They know really amazing things about neurons, all these things. But when they start to make when they start to generalize their idea and talk about human beings, you can see that they are not philosophers, because they don't see those the concept of happiness, the concept of trauma, the concept of disease. They don't see it as philosophers. They are on a level of common sense, that those things are unchangeable and self-evident, that we have to be happy. Why do we have to be happy? I don't understand. So that's what they lack. So on some level, he's genius, of course, like one of the most amazing neuroscientists, and the one which is closest, the link between philosophy and neuroscience. But still, he's not a philosopher, and you feel it. You get nervous when you read him, because something that is difficult for you to understand, and some revelation we find in this thing. But then he's telling that we have to be happy. It's just corrupt.
I have a question that might be somewhat related. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
And it's also related to something what Nina brought up about the issue of complexification. So with relatively new interdisciplinary integrative approaches like neuropsychoanalysis, is there still too much that's being excluded, even though they're no longer excluding one another? Is there still too much that's being excluded? So for neuropsychoanalysis, on the neuroscientific side of it, with the focus on the brain, do they exclude too much the rest of the body? In particular, I think of digestion, and I've come across some articles that talk about how there are neurons in the stomach. I'm wondering, like, what kind of, is there a significant relationship that's worth bringing into the mix when it comes to talking about the brain and the rest of the body, and not simply the brain? Then on the psychoanalytic side of the equation, I think of criticisms that there's and particularly in practice and in psychiatry, there's too much of an isolation of the individual, and they don't incorporate social phenomena as much, or cultural phenomena. So is there still too much that's excluded, and could there maybe be a need for more inclusive paradigms that are capable of integrating a much broader range of phenomena? And I think, for example, I think I'm really into Peter Sloterdijk, and I think of his concept of anthropotechnics. And anthropotechnics would be a paradigm, a model that incorporates a very broad range of phenomena and isn't exclusively focused on just some certain things. If I'm making sense.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think you're right, and maybe Damasio actually is writing something about that. It's not only the brain, not only the substance that is in our skull, but it's all, actually the whole body. Because when you're scared, it doesn't start from your brain. The brain is something that reflects afterwards, but it's everywhere in other parts of your body. You start to feel this that you're scared. So it's not only this central organ as we suppose it to be. It's whole the body, and yeah, I think he even claimed that he made the suggestions that he would use some kind of other term to designate that it's not only brain, but it's this decentralized vision of the body. And if you employ this decentralized vision of your body, you start to understand things better. And if you employ this perspective as not the body as not centralized on the brain, but as a whole body that reacts, that affects. And it's also, we are moving towards this direction because as Malabou claims that it used to, brain used to, I think on the next lecture, yeah, we're supposed to read what should we do with our brain. And she criticized the perspective that brain used to be seen as the center of power. But yeah, we move towards this decentralization, but still it's not enough. And Damasio is the one who is showing that it's this decentralization, maybe it's not radical enough. Okay.